Hello. For this video, I wanted to talk about a concept or a set of principles that can help you when you're training with your dog, when you're using your positive reinforcement training and using an eye clicker. Now, if we're doing a search on training videos and we're watching the video and we're seeing that person training that dog to perform a particular request, everything that's happening in that video is individual and specific for that video. We can't completely transform that entire experience into your individual training session, because even though you might set the bigger picture or the environment up in the same way as a training video may have done, there's going to be a completely new set of circumstances layered within that environment, because that's going to be based on how you're delivering your technique and also how your dog is responding to you when you're delivering your technique. And so those things can greatly differ, but in very subtle ways that you might not notice. And for example, you might be working on a behaviour with your dog in the same environment, at the same time, the same day, and you may be seeing some success, but then the next time you train that behaviour in the same environment, you notice that your dog isn't responding to you the way that they were in the previous training. So when we have that sort of situation, we have to then look at the way we're delivering our technique and look at us and actually ask ourselves questions. And those questions relate to, is our technique deviating or looking different, or are we communicating that technique to our dogs in a slightly different way and not being aware of that? So it's really important that we're very proactive and we're able to adapt to those situations where our dogs might just be getting a little bit confused and we're not sure why. So it's a good thing to just take a step back and ask yourself a few questions. Am I deviating my technique? Am I not paying attention to the position of my arm? Am I moving my arm too fast so my dog isn't actually understanding what it is I'd like them to do? Am I not positioning myself in a way that, from my dog's perspective, they have a clear pathway to move freely depending on how I'd like my dog to move in that situation? And when we're thinking of those sorts of things, let's look at comparing, say, for example, the sit request with asking our dog to follow a hand target to move a couple of steps onto their mat. So if we're looking at that stationary exercise of the sit, where we'll be drawing our hand over our dog's head towards their bottom to then get them to lift their head up and tilt their bottom onto the ground for the sit, if we compare that with asking our dog to follow a hand target, we need to make sure that we're not standing in the way of our dog. We have to make sure that whatever pathway we're choosing to move our arm in, that our dog has a free thoroughfare to walk in that direction, so we're not blocking them. And so those sorts of things, paying attention to where we're standing, where we're positioned, what we're doing with our arm, are we making sure that our hand gestures are consistent for that particular request that we're trying to teach our dog? And also, most importantly, are we bridging or marking that behaviour at the very right time, at the point in time that is correct from our point of view, but also in a way that is clear and concise for our dog? And once again, we'll consider a few little differences when we get through the checklist. So for the first one, what does the behaviour look like from your dog's perspective? And we just touched on that with what a sit looks like compared to following a hand target when we're asking our dog to go to their mat or follow our hand in a direction for, a couple of steps. The second question to ask is, okay, so what do I need to really consider before I start training with my dog to work on this behaviour? And the first thing is, if you're wanting to teach your dog to sit, well, then make sure you're asking them to sit and you're training that request and asking them to perform that request on a surface that's comfortable, not hot and not cold, not slippery, not something that is going to be distracting for them. What about asking our dog to drop onto their mat? Well, once again, if you're wanting to train your dog to drop, the best thing to do is make sure that you have a nice comfortable mat that isn't going to be too flat, because the aim of the drop request is to have your dog lower their head and then crouch down and then have their belly touch the ground and then drop into that position. If you're trying to teach your dog how to drop on a very flat surface and a very hard surface like these floorboards, then you may be making it very difficult and uncomfortable for your dog. What about the next question that we should be asking, which is, what is going to be the starting point in relation to our dog? And once again, if we're asking our dog to sit, then we need to be standing in front of them. If we're wanting our dog to follow a hand target, then it makes sense that we're standing parallel to them, but in a way where we're facing towards them, but they're facing 90 degrees away from us, because we want to be able to move a hand in a way that our dog is able to follow. So the direction that we're wanting our dog to move also dictates where we should be positioning ourselves. The other question to sort of ask is, once again, in relation to the request that you're asking or the exercise that you're trying to teach your dog, what action do you need to do? Once again, how do you need to move your arm? How do you need to move your body? How is this going to be incorporated into the exercise in a way that, once again, you're not impeding your dog's movement and you're making sure that you're able to keep your gestures and your arm movements, whatever that action that you're going to be performing, in a consistent way. So, for example, when we're teaching our dog to follow our hand to walk onto their mat, we don't want to be lifting our arm up. We want to make sure that our arm is parallel to the ground at all times, because that's going to mean that from our dog's eye level perspective, they'll easily be able to see our hand and they'll be able to follow it in the direction. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm referring to the action that we need to do, and how we need to consider that with respect to the exercise and how that exercise looks from our dog's perspective. And the very last thing to think about is really important, because we need to make sure we're timing our bridge and rewarding at the appropriate time. Now, using a clicker is the best way to go because it's less confusing. It really crisply marks the exact time where our dogs have performed the right behaviour, and we can communicate that to them very readily. So, when we're thinking about the timing of our bridge and rewarding our dogs, let's look at the sit again. When do we really want to bridge and use our clicker? We want to use that at the exact point in time where our dog's bottom touches the ground, because that's the sit in action, if you like. Now, when we're thinking about mat training, when we're thinking about the timing of our bridge, if we're asking our dog to go to their mat, then it makes sense that we want to bridge at the exact point in time where our dog's paw has stepped onto the mat, and then build onto that from there. So overall, they're pretty good questions to think about and pretty good questions to ask yourself when you find that you might be stalled during your training session and you're not sure why. Always question whether you may have just deviated slightly in your technique when you're delivering your communication to your dog in that way. So being able to adapt to your training environments, being able to look at your dog and understand what their emotional state is based on their body language, and knowing when it's time to finish your training session because of your dog's emotional state where they might be getting confused, but also understanding when it's time to end the training session and end the training session on a high note for your dog, on something where you know that they're going to be successful, so it's a really nice positive outcome for them. But knowing when to end that training session based on where your technique may be deviating and you just probably need to practice on your own without your dog. Just practice your movement and practice your arm movements and revisualise the exercise in your head, and then come back to the training session again with a fresh pair of eyes. So hopefully you'll incorporate those little principles and ask yourself those questions next time you're training with your dog. And that's where we'll leave the video, and we'll talk again soon.